Thanks, Thomas. Thanks for coming. I have the tough task of saying something original about experimental lettering after Matthew Carter's talk last night. It's a little bit intimidating. I'll try to do my best. So I'm going to talk to you today about the rules of the game, modular scripts, and generative design. And I want to say first off that finding novel ways of representing writing systems certainly did not start with European and modernism in the 20th century, but modernism certainly made its contribution. Even just skimming across the surface, we can think of the work of people like Herbert Bayer, Josef Albers, Kurt Schwitters, and Theo van Doesburg. Moving on through people like Jan Schichold, Max Bill, Adolphe Cassandre, and jumping ahead a little bit into designers like Wim Crouwel and Jurriaan Schrofer. Some pretty well-known pieces here. And continuing right up to this day with the work of designers like Philippe Ebloig and the work of Hamish Mir and Paul McNeil. Now, modernism has given some pretty radical examples of how you can depart from the way that people thought or think that letters are supposed to look. But a few of these designs, or so I'm going to argue today, depart from conventional letterform design in ways that actually go much deeper than appearance. And I want to talk about a particular example. This is a pretty badass picture, isn't it? So Jurriaan Schrofer, obviously the sort of design decorative lettering, this experimental lettering, was a very big part of his practice, and there are many examples of it, but there was one design of his in particular that he kept coming back to over and over again, and it was a design that he called his Illegible Alphabet. The sketches that he has for this alphabet, and he used it in lots of places, covering fields, a lot of book cover design, wonderful patterns like this. The sketches go back at least as far as 1970. And he included the alphabet in two retrospective collections of his work. One was a 1974 exhibition in the Museum Fodor. The catalog was designed by Wim Crouwel. And then much later in 1987 in a book he published called Letters op Mat, or Letters Made to Measure. Early versions of the lettering, as you can see from the sketch again, right? They certainly had some very unusual formal features, but they still in many places tracked our ideas or conventional ideas of what letters are supposed to look like. But as he started to reform and tighten his design, he started mixing upper and lower case forms of the letters much more freely. He included shapes that echoed the gestures and the traces of handwriting. So if you look, for example, at the H, there we go, right there. I have to struggle to find the H. Okay, you can see that he starts to, there he is, right there, right? He starts to do this kind of like back and forth, doubling back over the strokes. He included or left out shapes like serifs and tails strategically to try to fill that space. In some cases, he mirrored the design on both sides, and in some cases, he even reduced the letter forms into just abstractions, like the directions of contrast. But there's another fascinating quality about this design, and that's this, that as you start to change the weight, there becomes a lot of ambiguity between the negative and the positive space in the letter forms. So what looks like a stroke at a very thin weight starts to look like a space at a very heavy weight, and vice versa. But that's not even the most interesting thing about this design. The most interesting thing to me about this design is the way that Schrofer went around making it. He gave us a very simple description of this process in 1974, 1974. And I'm going to apologize in advance for my awful translations from the Dutch. I relied a lot on Google for this and some wild guesses. I'm embarrassed to say that I don't speak Dutch. What he said here, referring to this diagram of a grid that he put into the middle of the text with 9 implied points and 12 vertical and horizontal segments, he wrote 8 of the 12 segments in these letter forms must be used for each letter, and no 4, 6, or 8 segments can form a closed circuit. Now, in Letters op Mat, he gave us a little bit more detail. At the upper left of the diagram, he writes 2 columns, read left to right and top to bottom, showing a given element, a cross, an inverted T-bar, a horizontal line, etc. On the left, with all possible segments that I could draw above it, on the right below it, in the rightmost column, all the possible combinations of these elements, he means, 28 of them, which satisfy the conditions. that they consist of the same number of segments, 8, and form a continuous line. The bottom of the diagram, so this area down here, that area down there, shows the 196 total different shapes created by rotating and mirroring the basic 28 combinations. From that group, I chose the 36 characters of the illegible alphabet. Now, I'm going to get picky for just a second. There are actually only 192 shapes because Schrofer inadvertently repeated 4 of them. And since we're being picky, I will point out that of the 36 shapes that he chose, 5 of them are doing double duty. So the G, the I, the O, the S, and the Z are also the 9, the 1, the 0, the 5, and the 2. But what's important to me is the process that Schrofer is describing here. First, he generates a system of forms, and then he chooses which of those forms, protoglyphs, if you want to call them that, would become glyphs. So what he's doing is he's actually negotiating between the system that he generated on the one hand and his understanding of his writing system and its methods and reference models on the other. So if we allow the word script to mean any system of shapes or glyphs used to represent the characters of a writing system, then Schrofer's illegible alphabet is what I would call an example of a modular script. And a modular script is a script whose glyphs are elements of a design language that can be generated by a shape grammar. Let me unpack that. Shape grammars are systems of generating geometric forms, and they include 3 essential elements. First of all, they have a vocabulary of shapes that includes how those shapes can be operated on and transformed. They can be translated, reflected, rotated, scaled, and so on. And in modular scripts, shapes and the ways that they can be operated on and transformed are radically reduced so that they become anonymous and interchangeable. The shapes in a modular script can come from simply decomposing and reducing the components of characters in familiar writing systems. So this script, for example, that André Gürtler designed for the cover of the March 1966 typographische Monatsblätter. Or the designer can simply, and here's the reconstructed space for that, or the designer can simply choose simple shapes from scratch. So Hamish Mirror and Paul McNeil here with Panopticon and 3-point, right, choosing these shapes right from the start. In Schrofer's illegible alphabet, oh, hold on just a second here. And that is not starting. Okay, well, you have to imagine that rectangle dancing. There it goes, okay. In the illegible alphabet, Schrofer uses a shape vocabulary that consists of a single rectangle that can be rotated in 90-degree increments. It can be multiplied, it can be overlapped, and can be combined. In Josef Albers' Kombinationsschrift, the basic shapes are a 1-unit square, a circle, and a quarter circle that can be rotated in 90-degree increments. And you can see in these diagrams just the level of reduction and interchangeability that just the quarter circle itself in the Kombinationsschrift is doing. All of those shapes above represented by the same shape below. So shape vocabularies that are reduced, anonymous, and interchangeable. The second essential element of a shape grammar is spatial relations, a set of spatial relations which are methods of arranging the shapes in the vocabulary. And in modular scripts, the spatial relations are defined by the affordances of the shapes. What do I mean by affordances? Affordances is the thing that Louis Kahn was getting after when he advised his students that were sort of stuck on their architectural designs to honor their materials by asking them what they wanted. So very famously, for example, asking, what does a brick want? What do bricks want? Well, you can do lots of things with bricks. You can pile them up, you can scatter them all over the place. But if you listen to them, Kahn is implying, what they really want is they want to be stacked. Or they want to be offset or aligned in ways that are proportional to their construction. They want to be offset at angles that reflect their rectilinear dimensions. And very famously, of course, according to Kahn, bricks love arches. So in the very same way, Schrofer's, the shapes in Schrofer's script Sorry, I'm having trouble getting those. There we go. Okay. So the rectangles in Schrofer space want to be aligned. They want to be overlapped and offset in proportions and in angles that reduce the visual tension between their outlines. In much the same way, the constant unit scale of Albers' Kombinationsschrift want similar treatment. And because of the shape vocabulary being different, contrast and visual tension in the designs is going to be inevitable, but the shapes still like to share edges and alignments. The other thing to realize about the spatial relationships in a modular script is that because they are defined strictly in terms of the shape vocabulary, they're really tightly integrated into the design space, and we can start to think about those shapes and relations as parameters. Parameters of the design space that can be very precisely described and cataloged. And of course, the other thing that you can do with parameters is you can adjust them. So in this sample that Albers made for the Kombinationsschrift, we see him adjusting the parameters of the grid that he's using to draw his letters. So he's changing the number of, or the height of the columns, or the width of the number of columns between the gutters. You can even adjust the parameters of Schrofer space as well. If you think of it as simply an array of segments and nodes, you could adjust the number of nodes, you could adjust the position and the direction of the segments, so that if it was configured differently, you could end up with Eric Moyer's script. Or configured differently again, and you could get something like Wim Crouwel's script. Or do it differently again, and you could even end up with Douglas Hofstadter's script for the Letter Spirit project. So we have a shape vocabulary, we have a set of spatial relations, and the third essential element of shape grammars are shape rules. Shape rules are ways that you can use the operations and the transformations and arrangements in a design space to move that design from one state to another. And again, those shape rules are defined strictly by the shape vocabulary and the spatial relations, so they become just as integrated into that design space as the other elements. And what shape grammars do is generate design languages. The design languages are, so to speak, all the things that you can say with the design space. So all the permutations, all the different things that you can construct with that space according to those rules. So that according to the shape grammar behind the illegible alphabet, there are 192 shapes that you can say. Or in André Gürtler's script, at least the way that I've reconstructed it, his rules are that you have 7 shapes, 45 different positions. The glyphs cannot be any single shape in any one of those possible locations, or any 2 shapes so long as they don't touch or overlap. So according to these rules then, there are 677 shapes that you can say with a design space. Josef Albers' Kombinationsschrift. There we go. Count through it really fast. You can actually count through it. So his design space, right, his shape rules say that you can basically create any shape using combinations of at least one of the 3 shapes in its vocabulary in any possible transformation in any position allowed by the grid. So you can essentially count through by 7s. Here are 2,700 of the 4.3 trillion things you can say with Josef Albers' design space. Now, because modular scripts are so formally striking, we tend sometimes to assume that the module of a modular script is just the shape. But properly speaking, a module is the smallest possible unit of a design in terms of which you can understand and explain the entire design. So if we just looked at the shapes of these scripts, we wouldn't be able to account for their entire design languages. We would need to know the spatial relations and the shape rules as well. So the module of a modular script is, in fact, its shape grammar. So what this means is that there's actually a lot in common between modular scripts on the one hand and a lot of serial and generative art on the other. So for example, the work of people like Richard Paul Lohse or Karl Gerstner, or Vera Molnar, or Manfred Mohr. All of these exploring space serially in very much the same way, up to and including people like Sol LeWitt. When you think about some of his serial art. And the interesting thing about Sol LeWitt, and here is the diagrams and the positions of his 122 variations of an open cube. Not so long ago, Radim Peshko created his own modular script based on the same visual or virtual design space that Saul LeWitt was using. So there are three important things to remember about the languages that shape grammars or modules in a modular script generate. The first thing to remember is because how constrained they are, those design languages are finite. Even if they're also very large, as in the case of Josef Albers, right? There's a limited number of things that you can say with those design languages. The second thing to remember is that the design language and the script are not the same thing. And I'm going to come back to that point here in just a second. And the third thing to remember about these design languages is that the entire process of generating them, generating a design language from a module, happens independently of the writing system and its methods and its reference models. And this is radically different from the conventional process of letterform design. Because conventionally, what usually happens is that our ideas of what letters should look like, our memory of our experience with a writing system, the methods we have for reproducing it, the reference models that we might be using, all of those inform a plan for the tools that we're going to use to make marks, whether we're talking about actual or virtual tools, the methods that we can use those tools to make those marks, a set of instructions for what letterforms we're going to make, even most of the experiments with new letterforms that we see, all the ones I showed you earlier, most of them, for the most part, all work this way, even if they look formally very unusual. But in modular scripts, there is no such plan. Designers aren't actually asking themselves how best to faithfully reproduce these pre-existing ideas of what letters should look like in a design space. What they're doing is negotiating between those ideas and the design space to find letters in those spaces. And this is a process much less of memory and experience and one much more of discovery and extension and imagination, sometimes even play. Put another way, a modular script does much more than represent a writing system in a novel way. It plays a formal game. And it invites the designer and the reader to figure out what the rules of that game are and to play along. There's two observations I want to make in closing. First of all, the definition that I'm offering of modular scripts, I don't mean this as a history. It's a reconstruction. So I don't want to imply that all the designers of scripts that could fit the definition of modularity actually work this way. Most of them almost certainly worked in more conventional ways. And even Schrofer's early sketches showed that this later account he offers in Letters ab Mat is at least partially a post-rationalization of his process. He's going back and revisiting it and teasing the logic out of it. So what I'm doing here is I'm really reconstructing the logic of modularity. I'm not trying to relate its history. And the second observation I want to end with is that the independence that I'm describing is never total in practice. For one thing, there are some basic characteristics that any system of forms that we want to call writing has to have, just to be recognized as writing. The shapes have to be disjointed, they need to be rationally spaced, they need to be of about uniform size, consistently drawn, relatively simple, et cetera, just to be writing in the first place. So the relationship between modular scripts and writing systems actually looks a little bit more like this. Not just any generative shape grammar is going to do if you want to create a modular script. You need this little extra connection between your writing system saying, yeah, it's not just any system that's going to produce the shapes that I need. But even further, modular scripts, like all scripts, are systems of forms that are combined with sets of meaning. And these meanings are a semantic system that has to be present for a script to be a script. As in generative design more generally, this requires and highlights the need for human judgment. Human judgment that generative processes can't replace. Douglas Hofstadter very famously argued when he was reviewing Donald Knuth's Metafont program in Visible Language in 1982, there is no algorithm, no module for a modular script that will do what Scotty is asking this 1980s desktop to do, which is to generate even just an A from scratch, let alone all possible A's, or a script of all the letters in any script possible for a writing system. Okay. But that having been said, thinking of modules and generating design languages independently of writing systems and reference models is a really good way of developing critical leverage into all the assumptions that we make about what letters are supposed to look like. It forces designers and readers to recognize and question those assumptions in a visually accessible and, I would say, very engaging way. So modular scripts are an invitation not just to figure out the rules and play a formal game of meaning, but it's also an invitation to expand our understanding of what and how writing can mean. Thanks.